What's going on, vets? Today on Cannabis Reality, this is a three-part series about addiction. I'm going to have Dr. Corey Burchman, he's a retired colonel from the Navy, and Dr. Darina Douchi, a retired major from the Army. Each one of them have specialties and are board members of Hemp for Victory. So if you want to find out some more about the credentials, check us out on hempforvictory.info and the number 4, and go on there and take a look at their credentials. You're going to really like this episode. We're going to talk a lot about what in the body makes an addiction happen, and then how cannabis can treat and help with addiction as well. So stick around, guys. You're going to like this. Welcome, everybody, to Cannabis Reality here, talking with Dr. Darina Douchi and Dr. Corey Burchman. We appreciate you guys coming on board and talking about this, about what addiction is. And then we also want to talk about what does it do to the body and how cannabis can help, right? First off, when we talk about chemical addiction, how is that defined? I mean, if a person's doing something on a daily routine every single day, where does that become an addiction? If, let's say, they're smoking cigarettes 2 or 3 times a day, is that the same thing as doing something else that you do routinely every single day? What becomes an addiction?
Well, I'll let Dr. Corey actually start with that one first, since he is a physician. I like his insight first.
Darina. And first of all, Robert and Darina, it's a pleasure to be with you. I am constantly impressed by your expertise and the ability that you guys have to express yourself. So I just appreciate being here and having this opportunity. So I'm a neuroanesthesiologist. I've been studying the brain for over 35 years as a practicing clinician. And also I manage pain. And I was one of those guys in the 1990s writing opioid prescriptions for all of my patients because, the National Institute of Health and the American Pain Association said pain was the 5th vital sign, and we as physicians were not aggressive enough in addressing it. And I think this was part of the opioid epidemic. Of course, it's morphed into something much worse than it was, presently. But when I think of substance abuse and use that term interchangeably with addiction, it's also behavior abuse. For example, gambling or sex and other behaviors can be addicted to. But from the brain standpoint, it's kind of the same. What it means, first of all, is that an individual is using more of the substance than they intend to. They try to quit, but they fail. They spend a lot of time either thinking about or using the substance. They crave it. And they also continue to use it in the sense, say, of opioids or nicotine or alcohol. They use it knowing full well that it causes problems socially, at school, at home, at work. And it gets to the point where it becomes the obsession, and they give up friends, they give up social contacts in favor of using the substance. They put themselves in high-risk situations, such as driving an automobile, or maybe driving a bus where they're responsible for multiple lives. And then there's this concept called habituation, where they need more of the substance to get the same reward. And then finally, and maybe most importantly, and Darina can talk extensively about this, I bet, is that they experience withdrawal symptoms when they stop the use of the substance. The craving continues. All right, I'll stop there. But that's a pretty good summary of what addiction is, at least from the clinical standpoint.
Dr. Douchi?
Yeah, absolutely. No, you're absolutely on point, Dr. Corey, and I like the way you explained it actually in a more easier format. So like he said, it becomes a compulsion more than anything. It's a chronic, right? So we call it a brain disorder. A lot of people don't really realize it is a brain disorder, but it is, because it actually changes your brain, the way your brain talks to itself and how it sends those messages. It also just works on the dopamine, system in your brain. And the dopamine system is the reward system. So you teach it, I give you, it sends a response and it receives something else. When that mechanism of receiving and talking itself gets destroyed when you have an addiction in place. And addiction doesn't usually happen from the first use or second use, although we have seen that actually sometimes with some heroin patients and Oxycontin, with the Oxycontin epidemic that we are facing, is that some patients that were taking it once or twice and they became addicted to it. Now, was that a genetic disorder, or was it just that pathway of the dopamine pathway got ruined? Some of those medications ruin the brain permanently, and you really can't reverse that change. And we see that with heroin and cocaine and so on with time. So it develops in a way where so you have the dopamine, that's the reward mechanism. When you activate that system and you're always excited, when you take away the substance, the patient doesn't feel happy anymore. They drop, their happiness, that reward goes down. So they don't really feel satisfied. So they go back to that same substance or something similar. So if you take away one substance, or it could be an activity, really, it's not just, you have people that are addicted to porn. You hear me talk about that a lot because that's the new thing right now, and even food is now being looked at because of the dopamine pathway. And then on that dopamine pathway, there's signaling to other receptors in the brain. We call those the mu receptors. The mu receptors is what's actually part of the opiate system, the opiate addiction system. Basically, you have 3 different types. The one that are really responsible for addiction are more so the mu receptors. So mu receptors, they're not just, let's say you have 1,000 of them in your brain. As you continue to use the substance, your brain starts to develop new mu receptors with time. And that's where the craving happens. And it's as your brain starts to ask for more of it. So we start to give it more and more. And it's just at some point, because those substances work on the same systems or same parts of the brain that regulates the rest of your body, it also paralyzes like your oxygen and CO2 mechanism that makes you breathe, right? Or your intestines. So it stops your intestines from moving at the same time. So that's why you see people that take painkillers, they're very constipated. Well, it works on your intestinal motility, right? That movement. They stop breathing because it stops, the brain can't function, can't recognize that I'm short on breath, I'm short on oxygen, I need to take a deep breath. It just does not make that connection because that's been destroyed.
I see people.
Right. I was just going to say that's a great summary.
Thank you.
I see people who have addictions and they will stay completely away. Let's say it's an alcohol addiction. They won't even come close to alcohol. Some people won't even go to bars or other locations like that for fear of that addiction to start back up. But I see other people who have no problems with going to alcohol and have very little addiction problems in their life. Seems to be certain people have a higher risk for addiction than others. And is that something that is true in our world, that somebody could have a higher percentage of addiction rate than somebody else, right? For me, I don't feel like I get addicted to very much of anything. I can control what it is. I can come in and out of my life. But I feel like there's some people out there who don't have that control. So they have to really manage their life in a much different way to avoid certain things, to keep that addiction from catching hold. Is that true? Because it seems that way from just the
I think there. I'm sorry to interrupt, but it's something Darina touched on, and that is sort of the structural brain definition of addiction. I mean, addiction occurs because of certain structures in the brain and the receptors. And this is primarily, as she had said, in the limbic system, which is deep inside the primitive brain, where dopamine is sort of the material, the neurotransmitter that gets turned on, either with sex, with opioids, even with cannabis. Okay, thanks. That's a graphic I had put up about areas in the brain that are involved in sort of the reward system. But Robert, your point is very good, and that is that there are certain genes that some people possess that are expressed more than others that create this preference or this predilection towards addiction. That doesn't mean that if somebody who doesn't have this preference can't get addicted, but they're less prone to it, maybe because they may in fact have a deficiency within the limbic system dopamine basis. And they, like, I read this great article about alcoholism where many alcoholics, and they found this out when they died and they did autopsies, they had a relatively lower density of these dopaminergic neurons in their limbic system, and that their need to use alcohol was compelled because they were just trying to medicate themselves to become normal. Do you follow what I mean? But because alcohol is a highly addictive, relatively toxic substance, there are all of those other aspects of addiction that sort of bring them down.
So you're saying,
and then the other point I wanted, well, the only other point I wanted to make, and we'll get into this later when we start talking about cannabis, is that two of the main brain drivers of addiction is a concept called memory, and something called a reconsolidation, which is reliving the memory. And when you mentioned an alcoholic going into a bar, they start to get cues of what it was like when they were drinking, and it was a very rewarding feeling, at least in the beginning. And those memories are one of the drivers that results in craving. And that craving, as well as the fear of withdrawal, is what drives the perpetuation, to a large extent, of addicts failing to quit, and they cause it results in significant relapse. And then a little bit later, I'll talk about what I think is just the most fascinating part of weed, of cannabis, in that it's one of the few substances that can actually address the root causes of addiction. And it's pretty exciting. I get really excited about it, but I'll wait and then we'll talk about that in a little bit.
So for what I'm hearing from a person who is not medically trained is that the dopamine receptors for a lot of people who are addicts are naturally are denser than the average person. And that alcohol and whatever chemical that they're using is releasing that and loosening that receptor up to where it's at a normal rate for everybody else. But they have to have this chemical addiction in order to achieve that. Is that what I'm hearing?
Yeah. Well, think of the brain as an 8-cylinder internal combustion engine. Okay. And when you're normal, when you're a normal person, you're firing on all 8 cylinders. You're functioning well. You're able to make executive decisions. You're able to have cognitive thought and rational processes. At least some theories in neuroscience believe that people prone to addiction are firing on 6, maybe 5, maybe 7 cylinders. And they have this sort of intrinsic need to just get up to normal. And through use of substances that sort of light the fires of the dopamine system, they can do that. But the problem, of course, is that it's not that easy. In other words, if you're going to buy yourself a little more dopamine, you're going to pay for it in terms of you're going to become addicted to it. And then all of those aspects of addiction that I talked about, the loss of social control, the risk-prone behavior, the need to continue to use more to get the same effect, all of those bad events occur.
Okay. So why is it that we don't really see a lot of people talk about the addiction to cannabis like you see with everything else? I know that the addiction rate for cannabis is extremely low. So how is it? First off, I'm kind of curious how they've come up with that addiction rate. And secondly, why is it so low? What is it? While we have the brain up, what's going on?
So back to the genetics and how it actually links to your cannabis. Great segue here, by the way. So they have actually identified different genes on different chromosomes that either get you addicted to nicotine, or you're more, you could be more addicted to alcohol or opiates. And they have also identified those that also could cause a cannabis addiction. The reason also cannabis, I don't consider it a true addiction, is the fact that the mu receptors we were talking about, when you take an opiate, with time, your body develops more mu receptors, needing more. You don't have that actually with cannabis. Cannabis does not cause that response, and that's how we usually, that's what we look at. Now, does it change your dopamine pathway? Yes, but the nice thing about cannabis, you stop it today, you don't really need it. What people fail to recognize is that because you feel good on cannabis, it's not just the psychoactive aspects of it. You know, feeling good on cannabis has a lot to do with the entire endocannabinoid system, which is throughout your entire body, which now that's the new concept, is that, is there a deficiency in the endocannabinoid system from your head to toe that's causing these different autoimmune disorders, fibromyalgia, you name it, MS. So when we give somebody the cannabis and they feel better, well, it's not just, and they've been feeling great. Now you take it away, they're not going to feel that good. Is that an addiction? That's really not an addiction, because you will see that same thing with somebody who's been on a prescribed antidepressant or blood pressure, or has been working out so long, and then you stop working out. Guess what? Your body, you're going to start to feel aches. Does that mean you were addicted? Not really, right? Because that's just your body had reached homeostasis. It had reached a happy medium where it can actually survive, function right. And then you take that away. Now you create a down spiral effect where now I'm back to pain. I can't sleep, and so on. The other things that when they have identified that gene that's related to cannabis addiction, for example, they've actually identified that in about 10% of the population. And they've actually seen it higher in European and African American, with some other genetics correlation that has to do with other addictions as well, that was related more to nicotine and so on. So the other thing about the cannabis addiction, when it comes to, they say, well, are you craving it? Is it destroying your life? That's how we usually see somebody who's been, on opiate, addicted to opiate, is that they have that compulsion, that impulses, that they can't control their impulses. They know that they are draining their children college funds. They have to go get that heroin dose, right? They just don't know how to stop. They can't. And when they're done with that, they feel shame, and they feel they spiral down, and the next day they have to go do it again. So you don't have that with cannabis. You never get that with cannabis. Now, you might be, some people look, well, they constantly think about cannabis. Well, maybe somebody has a high stress level that they rely on cannabis to regulate them.
Right. I was just going to say, you never hear about somebody sticking up a liquor store to go out and buy cannabis. It's not I don't even like to refer to cannabis as an addictive agent, although I've been working with the feds quite a bit, and they're sort of stuck on that term. I mean, cannabis use disorder is a real thing, and it does have some of the aspects that we describe of addiction, using more cannabis than intended, people kind of withdrawal that you go through with opioids or alcohol or ecstasy or methamphetamines, for example.